When the Soviet Union fell, the Anglo American order appeared to have done the impossible. They had won, and they had won total hegemony over the world. The term "the end of history" would emerge. Seeing the vast financial power in London, New York, and the European hubs, the raw economic might of the liberal world order was unquestionable. Its militaries and intelligence agencies were present all across the world. And increasingly, it appeared as though the liberal ideology which defined the order was on course to dominate the world. So many thought this was it. The structures and systems of the liberal world order would reign supreme, perhaps forever. For there was nowhere else to go, nothing more to be done. The ultimate and perfect end state of human existence had been discovered. There was no better system, and it was a liberal democracy. So, many thought, all that was left to do would be to bring the remaining nations of the world into the liberal world order's way of being. And of course, under liberal philosophy, this would flow naturally. Assuming a world of blank slates, it was thought that everyone was simply a liberal in waiting, who once freed and elevated to the economic prosperity which defined the West, would become just like them. There was a high, a rush. Western stock markets would climb, particularly on excitement around internet companies. The Anglo American financial machine would have extraordinary wealth, and its rate of growth would only increase as globalization would continue, creating cheap manufacturing bases outside of the West to produce inexpensive consumer goods for the consumer-based economies in the wealthy West. Yet, this end of history state of affairs did leave some lingering questions. Was there still a purpose to NATO? After all, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had, at least nominally, been set up as a counterforce to the Soviet Union. And now with the Soviet Union no longer existing, what was its justification for being? Within the foreign policy establishments of the West, though particularly the United States, sharp divisions were beginning to form. Some wanted a more cooperative relationship with the post-Soviet nations, and particularly the Russians, while others saw this as an opportunity to finally take all, to complete the Mackinderist dream, and to destroy the Russians that they had been afraid of and angry with for so long. The political, ideological movement of neoconservatism would grow in force. This is a group that had grown out of the 1960s and 70s left, yet who had become disillusioned with President Johnson's progressivism. They became enthralled with much older, Victorian liberal imperialism, believing that spreading the Anglo American order around the world was a force for good, believing that perhaps military force and intervention was necessary to make a better world. In 1991, President George Bush would promote the New World Order, a premise in line with the unipolar moment, the Anglo American order, and many notions that had existed since the old days of liberal imperialism. In 1991, the United States would lead Operation Desert Storm in Iraq, an effort of 42 countries to remove Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait. Though the Cold War had ended, the order still had to demonstrate its hegemony over the world, and had to clearly demonstrate the rules-based order that underlay their hegemonic power. If anything, the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War was signaling that the Anglo-American dominated liberal world order had to now demonstrate and enforce its might more than ever. In the first episode, we have explored the rise of the British Empire and the later Anglo-American world order. Yet now we are beginning to see it fall. We're beginning to see something else take its place. So how did that happen? The fall of the Soviet Union left an immense power vacuum in Eastern Europe. In 1991, Slovenia and Croatia would declare independence from Yugoslavia, a vast supernation in the Balkans. Within the nation, ethnic tensions were rising. Bosnian Serbs, led by Radovan Krajic, would form their own Serb National Assembly, and the following year, Bosnia and Herzegovina would hold their own referendum on independence. Bosniak Muslims and Croats would generally be in favor, with Bosnian Serbs opposed. And in March 1992, a Serb would be killed at a Sarajevo wedding. This story would become enormous, and would serve as a spark for the powder keg of ethnic tensions that were already rising. The following month, Bosnian Serb forces would blockade Sarajevo. This would result in a siege on the city. By this point, Western powers, and particularly figures in the British foreign policy establishment, had come to be quite averse to a powerful sovereign nation in the Balkans. They wanted the Balkans Balkanized. They would recognize the independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the United Kingdom would support peacekeeping troops in Bosnia. A Bosnian Serb army, led by Ratko Mladic, would take control of nearly 70% of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Western media, and particularly Fleet Street, would run constant depictions of Bosnian Serb atrocities and prison camps. The British foreign policy establishment wanted control over the outcome, and did not want a strong and sovereign nation. Secretary Douglas Hurd would become a major driving force, backing US troops as a part of a UN peacekeeping force, and attempting to gain US support. By this point, Britain's military strength was not significant, and they were particularly reliant on soft power, diplomacy, intelligence, and media. British intelligence and diplomats would work to resolve the conflict to their satisfaction. Two figures in particular would be quite prominent: Lord Carrington and David Owen, who each served as special envoy. The conflict would continue into 1994, when ultimately NATO would issue an ultimatum, demanding that Bosnian Serb forces withdraw from Sarajevo. This would result in the Washington Agreement, recognizing a distinct Bosnia and Herzegovina. This would be early into the presidency of Bill Clinton. He would take a public position of support for the enlargement of democracies, and we would begin to see more neocon figures entering into his White House. Though the United States had been reluctant to be quite as directly involved as the United Kingdom, the special relationship and the Anglo American order still clearly held. And now it was clear that Anglo America was going to take this opportunity to gain influence over the post-Soviet nations and to ensure that no powerful bloc emerged. In 1995, after Bosnian Serbs would overwhelm UN safe areas, Clinton would agree to become more directly involved, and the United States would lead NATO bombing missions in Bosnia. They would run a sustained air campaign against Bosnian Serb targets. And on December 14th, 1995, a peace agreement would be signed in Paris, with the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina formed. It would be further divided into two entities: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska. It was clear that the Anglo-American order was focusing on ensuring its global dominance. It was not willing to have any notable powers pulling away from its order. In 1996, the United States would begin to shift its focus to the Middle East, and the United Kingdom would support the United States in Iraq no-fly zones. Around this time, too, the question of NATO was beginning to have a more clear answer. In 1997, NATO would invite Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic to join. This would create concern in Russia, though over these years it still remained an open question as to whether Russia itself may one day be invited. The United States would become increasingly involved in the Middle East. In 1998, the UK would back the US in strikes on Iraq in Operation Desert Fox, owing to Iraq's refusal to adhere to United Nations Security Council demands. We would as well begin hearing stories of weapons of mass destruction potentially being present in the country. The United States would also bomb al-Qaeda sites in Sudan and Afghanistan. The United States military was very clearly taking on the role of acting as enforcer anywhere where the rules-based order appeared to be challenged. And around this time, too, problems would re-emerge in the Balkans. Back in 1989, Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic would revoke Kosovo's autonomy. This would lead to heavy resentments and resistance, though initially non-violent. Seeing quite little result, resistance would increase throughout the 1990s, becoming more violent over time. Ultimately, the Kosovo Liberation Army would form and begin attacking police and government targets. In February 1998, Serbian police would attack ethnic Albanian villages and kill 20. This would increase the drive of the Kosovo Liberation Army and galvanize support for it. The fighting would escalate. In March, Serbian forces would attack the compound of the KLA's leader, Adem Jashari. They would kill him and dozens of his family members. This would result in a wave of support from Albanians for the KLA. That summer, Serbia would launch an offensive to drive out the KLA from its strongholds. International media would run stories of ethnic cleansing. This again would be particularly driven by Anglo American media in Fleet Street. The UN Security Council would demand a ceasefire, withdrawal, and end to hostilities, though that predictably accomplished nothing. However, after a series of negotiations gathered little progress, in March 1999, NATO would begin a bombing campaign in Yugoslavia, in an effort to force Milosevic's forces to withdraw. This time the United States was much more directly involved, becoming much more aggressive militarily. The war hawk factions had more powerfully coalesced in the Clinton administration by this point. Figures like Madeleine Albright and General Wesley Clark would be powerful driving forces for the campaign, while in the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, who was very committed to the long-standing British foreign policy view, would be a vociferous force for involvement. The conflict would continue until June of 1999, where Yugoslav forces would withdraw, and international peacekeeping forces would enter, creating Anglo American military control in the region. The last of the Serbian forces would withdraw on June 11th of 1999. Now Anglo America had very clear hegemony in the Balkans. As the 1990s were coming to a close, the end of history still seemed to be in force. However, it was clear that this would not be an entirely peaceful period of history. Though Anglo America had used military force in efforts to ensure its hegemony, perhaps even more was being done financially and economically. The international banks, like the World Bank, IMF, and Bank for International Settlements, were highly active around the world, using development banking and debt to gain influences in foreign nations, in some cases taking direct control over whole industries and government policies which included what has been often criticized as debt slavery, or financial imperialism. At the same time, too, Anglo-American finance would become very involved in the post-Soviet nations. Large financial institutions, including the international banks, as well as private finance, would make very large investments into the post-Soviet states. Institutions including Hermitage Capital and the Harvard University Endowment would use their wealth to buy up large amounts of industry in these countries. Ultimately, this gave them the ability to mint what has been termed the oligarch class. By buying up very cheap assets, these foreign financiers were in a place to control enormous amounts of industry, and by putting those who they wanted in charge, they were creating a new ruling class. On the part of the Anglo American Establishment, and particularly the British Foreign Policy Establishment and London, this was an unbelievable opportunity to fulfill a multi-century long goal, the goal of gaining control in Russia. Now British firms were directly picking the oligarchs, though this would begin to draw some ire from the more nationally inclined Russians. The following year, Vladimir Putin would be elected president in Russia. He would look at all this foreign money and the power that the oligarchs had accumulated and recognize it as foreign control. He and his faction did not want this, and thus he would begin a policy of squishing down the power of the oligarchs, forcing out Anglo-American finance and intelligence, and creating a more nationalist government. Ultimately, he would succeed, and his faction would become dominant, failing yet another attempt for the British Empire to take over Russia. In their never-ending Tom and Jerry, Javert and Jean Valjean, Quark and Odo game of cat and mouse. However, at the same time, there was a pivot toward China. The raw economic potential of China was quite evident to the West, and as globalization had been underway, particularly with the Eurodollar system allowing nations like China to borrow large amounts of US dollars at artificially low interest rates, there was tremendous investment opportunity in China, and opportunity for very cheap labor. The Eurodollar credit system would be the wind in the sails of globalization, allowing quite poor nations to get extraordinarily wealthy extraordinarily quickly, all by borrowing US dollars from foreign banks at artificially cheap interest rates. One major detriment of this, however, is that it forces the United States to constantly remain in a worsening deficit, at least over longer time horizons. And more than that, it drains the purchasing power of the lower classes of the United States. And to pile on top of that, the offshoring of industry and labor was destroying once prosperous working and middle-class towns of the United States. Globalization was indeed creating a vast boom of wealth, yet it was creating a boom for foreign nations and for the financial class, all while parasitically draining the lower classes of America. Here we begin to see the building of some resentments, and this had been ongoing since the 1970s. However, the 1990s were a very powerful shift toward China, and in 2000, the United States would normalize trade with China, agreeing to permanent normal trade relations. And seeing that the takeover and creation of the oligarchs of Russia had largely failed, Anglo American finance began to eye China. Perhaps it could repeat that strategy there. That same year, George Bush would be elected president. Initially, he seemed quite interested in projects like aerospace technology, perhaps even a space program itself. He was looking at missile technology, and his view of what the military ought to be focusing on was quite different than what would emerge. In fact, initially, he wasn't even entirely in the sphere of the neocons. Yet, 9/11 would change that. In September of 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center would serve as a very clear demarcation in American policy. It would deeply entrench the influence of the neocon faction. It would increase support for interventions in the Middle East. It would fully launch the modern global war on terror, and it would create a sufficiently scared and angry environment to justify the Patriot Act. One thing that is quite significant about the liberal world order and its rules-based system is that it really isn't able to tolerate anyone breaking from it. For if a nation were to break from the rules-based order, then that would indicate that they aren't really rules, just mere suggestions. Thus, to enforce and ensure the order, it was recognized that it was very important to make sure that nobody broke away. That nobody broke away from the military policies. That the borders which were recognized by the order maintained intact. And perhaps most importantly, that nobody broke away from the monetary financial order. For if one nation were to break away from the London system financial order, then that could cause a chain reaction where others do. And one of the most important things within that system is the financial intermediaries maintaining control over world commodities. That the exchanges maintain the ability to influence commodity prices via futures. And that the world continued to run on US dollar credit. Credit which was maintained and overseen by the Eurodollar banks. In 2001, the United States would launch Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. The following year, the United States would create the Department of Homeland Security. The new Bush Doctrine would emphasize the importance of preemption, asserting that the Anglo American order was fully justified in preemptive measures, preemptive attacks, in order to secure the rules-based order. That same year, the British intelligence agencies would publish a dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Prime Minister Blair would back a US-led Iraq policy. Media across the West, though particularly prevalent in London, would spread a story of weapons of mass destruction around the world, creating a casus belli for new actions against Saddam Hussein. The neocon warhawk factions were all on board, the foreign policy establishment of Britain, the intelligence agencies, the financiers. So many of the dominant factions all wanted to go into Iraq, and though there was dissent, it was quite clear which factions had dominance, and all that was left now was to tell the public a story. In 2003, the United States, with the United Kingdom, would lead Operation Iraqi Freedom, an invasion of Iraq. There would be enormous backlash in the United Kingdom, though, despite the opposition, Prime Minister Blair would demonstrate intense support for the operation. The United States and United Kingdom, along with coalition members, would be quite active in the Middle East, and they would make it quite clear the extent to which the order was willing to go to enforce its interests, to enforce its rules, to enforce its system, and to more generally enforce its control. There were geostrategic purposes to this, as there were financial. there were interests of the military-industrial complex, and there were ideological reasons. Yet in aggregate, the purpose was quite clear. This was an operation for the strength of the order. The following year, NATO would add a further 7 new members, and the power of the Anglo American Establishment appeared to be unquestionable. Support was generally quite high despite some opposition, though the governments of the West had largely come to be accustomed to there always being some level of opposition to war. However, cracks would begin to form. In 2004, the Abu Ghraib scandal would emerge, detailing what appeared to be practices of tortures and humiliations by Anglo American troops in an Iraq prison. The United States and United Kingdom would promote a freedom agenda for the Middle East. The story had become one that was quite reminiscent of the old Victorian liberal imperial story, that the militaries were being used to bring freedom and liberalism to people who were being oppressed. So the story went that these regime changes must be done, that these wars must happen, that there must be Anglo-American hegemony, because there are unscrupulous actors in the world. There are abusive leaders, and ultimately everyone wants to be a free liberal just like us, and they just need our help to do it. We are liberators. It was a marvelous story, yet one that would begin to deteriorate over time. Over the following years, there would be a troop surge into Iraq. However, by 2006, the United Kingdom would announce phased withdrawals, with the United States continuing to surge into 2007. A year prior, in 2006, Hamas would win control in Palestine following an election, and that same year, a war between Israel and Hezbollah would emerge. Tensions surrounding the Israeli state and the Palestinians appeared to be rising again. In 2007, the Annapolis Conference for Middle East Peace would be held, with the nations around the world creating a roadmap for a more stable state of affairs in the Middle East, and the potential for a Palestinian state. There was of course no real interest in stability in the Middle East, yet at this point, keeping this going as a constant powder keg was in line with the perpetual casus belli and perpetual ability to agitate that had been in place since Sykes-Picot, and can be observed around the world in places where European empires have vacated, at least on the map. During these years, people were beginning to question the order. People were beginning to question these wars, and if there really was any interest in peace. It was beginning to look quite clear that perhaps the end of history might actually be the beginning of forever war. There was great doubt as to whether there ever really were any credible suspicions of WMDs in Iraq. And there's something rather odd that happened here, because in part, the WMD story was a story for public consumption and for casus belli. Many of the images people were led to have in their heads were untrue. However, there do indeed appear to have been WMDs, particularly chemical weapons. But because it was presented as propaganda, and because other elements of the conflict were clearly lies, trust was beginning to shatter as a whole. People were beginning to wonder why the conflict between Israel and Palestine seemed to constantly pop up every time there was a geostrategic reason for it to, only to be half-heartedly solved and put back away in the shelf to form another war when it would be useful. Was the liberal world order really a good force? Was the rules-based international order really a force for peace and good if it seemed to create only more war? There were doubts rising. And though there wasn't an enormous dissident move across the West, belief in the order was simply weakening. Distrust was growing. And though it's quite far from what it is at today, people were just beginning to wonder. People's confidence was shattered. Yet the economy was still largely strong, and people were feeling pretty good about their lives. Particularly at this point, people were buying up homes very inexpensively. The mortgage market was booming, and people were buying houses very cheap. Houses that seemed like they should be impossible for people to be able to afford. However, cracks began to form. And while people widely do point to the cracks in the mortgage market, particularly the market for securitized mortgage-backed securities, there were larger cracks within the global credit system. These decades of the euro-dollar system providing very cheap loans across the world, the constant leverage upon leverage, the rehypothecation engine of the offshore and London banks, The entire system was simply piling up too high. Mortgages were a very clear example, and one of the most prominent places where these cracks became evident. Though the Eurodollar credit system as a whole was simply getting away from itself, the economic reality was just not in line with all of the promises that existed within the system. And as 2007 rolled on, investment funds began to fail. Banks began seeing cracks in their portfolios, cracks that became crises, and the economy began to worsen. By 2008, these cracks had grown into a true global financial crisis. Large financial institutions across the West would fail, all around the same time. A debt crisis would emerge in Europe. Insurance products, investment funds, derivatives, large credit portfolios. So much of the global financial system would be affected as the crisis would hit. The United States would lead a response of the G20 countries, all while the Federal Reserve would open up liquidity to save the financial institutions. In the United Kingdom, there would be bank nationalizations, while in the United States there would be large bailouts, buy-ins, and the mortgage giants of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would effectively become servile to the federal government. Prime Minister Gordon Brown would push for global coordination in response to the crisis, and as the crisis would go on, the Federal Reserve would open up its emergency funding to banks around the world, though there would be direct and visible bailouts in the United States, although generally from distressed asset purchases and from forcing financial firms to buy other financial firms. Via the Fed's facilities, enormous funds would be injected into Eurodollar banks globally. Banks like UBS, Credit Suisse, Barclays, HSBC, Nomura, Deutsche Bank, and many more. The global Eurodollar banks as a whole were facing crisis. The system had gotten away from itself, and yet at the same time while the liquidity hose was being turned on, the mortgage market and the yield curve were changed. The power over the pricing of the long end of the US yield curve that previously had been influenced quite heavily by American mortgage borrowers had been destroyed, and as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were effectively seized by the government, the wealth creation machine of the 30-year mortgage was destroyed. Now via LIBOR, via the derivatives markets, via Eurodollar lending, and via carry trades, the global Eurodollar banks had true control over the US yield curve, all while the American middle and lower classes were facing foreclosures. They were losing their jobs. The economy was worsening and worsening, and the powerful financial figures who were watching this happen from the top of the towers knew that it would only be a matter of time before something much more dire would affect their financial system. Thus, we entered the permanent low-interest rate environment, a world of constant liquidity injection and artificially cheap money. Hopefully this would be enough to keep the system limping along, to keep the London machine, to keep the mighty Eurodollar banks, to keep the Anglo American order, and to keep the debts of many nations going just long enough for the big players to seize assets should they need to abscond. This is a pattern we have seen through time. When a debt system collapses, the old oligarchs take what they can and leave. As Barack Obama would begin as president, he would publicly proclaim his support for a reset with Russia. In 2010, the United States would sign the New START Treaty with Russia, an agreement designed for nuclear arms reduction. The order was taking a new approach to Russia, realizing that the Putin government could not be dealt with financially, and that it was still a substantial military power. These years saw the foreign policy establishments of the United States and United Kingdom looking for new avenues. In 2010, a wave of revolts, uprisings, clashes, and revolutionary movements would emerge across the Arab world. Beginning in Tunisia, the Arab Spring would sweep across Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. Of course, the United States and Great Britain, along with other European actors, would be quite involved, and the groundwork would be set for regime change. Despite the heightened discontent from the Iraq War, and people beginning to doubt Afghanistan, there was still tremendous momentum in the region, and the Anglo American order was far from done with its projects. It would finance militant organizations, as well as giving backing and training, creating armies which could be manipulated to geostrategic purposes. The following year, the United States would kill Osama bin Laden, and a NATO intervention would be launched in Libya, with leader Muammar Gaddafi being ousted and ultimately killed. The United States would withdraw its troops from Iraq that year, and now military and intelligence operations were much more focused around militants. Yet at this time, it became more evident that Anglo America was shifting its focus to Asia. Focus was being placed on China, and Anglo American intelligence and financiers would become tightly interwoven with the Chinese economy. Yet in 2012, Xi Jinping would become leader of China. He had a quite different view for the country, one much more nationalist and opposed to these Anglo-American interlopers. And so it appeared that the peak of that globalization in China may have come, and many across Western finance and intelligence began to become quite worried. These years would see heavy uses of sanctions. Sanctions on Iran would increase, while the United States would as well sanction Russia and China. It was, however, beginning to become a question just how effective these sanctions were. And at the same time, while cracks were beginning to appear in Anglo-American hegemony, internal dissent in the United States was rising. Following the financial crisis, groups like Occupy and the Tea Party had begun to gain some real momentum. There was increasing distrust. And in 2014, Edward Snowden would reveal that the scope of NSA surveillance and data gathering was beyond what people had imagined. People began asking themselves if perhaps the government viewed the people as a threat to them. People began to reflect on the era that they had just been through, reflect on the Patriot Act, and more, internally and externally, the order, the power, and the actions of Anglo America were beginning to be called into question. In 2014, ethnic divides in Ukraine would reach a much more serious state, all while NATO and Anglo America continued their long-standing policy of attempting to gain influence in Eastern Europe and reduce the might of Russia. NATO was pushing its sphere to the east. Ethnic Russian separatists would form the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. CIA and MI6-backed elements would effect a color revolution in Ukraine, and the government of Viktor Yanukovych would end. New social policies would be enacted, ones much more in line with the Anglo-American vision, and anti-Russian. Russian media would be removed from the country, and de-Russination would be in effect. Alexander Turchinov would become president, all while conflict between the separatists and the Ukrainian military would escalate in the east. Ultimately, Russia would invade Crimea, citing that ethnic Russians were being abused by Ukraine, that Ukraine had come under the influence of foreign governments, and that it was their moral duty to protect ethnic Russians, their own people, from a hostile and alien government. Meanwhile, the Western-backed Ukrainians would state that this is only pretense. They would assert that Russia simply wanted the strategic territory of Crimea, and that this justification of defending Russians was merely an excuse, one like those of aggressors in history. Regardless of whose justification one wishes to side with, it was becoming quite clear that there was no room for Russia in the Anglo-American order, that the Mackinderist vision was as it always had been, one where the goal was a weakened and divided Russia. Russia would demand that Ukraine not be allowed to enter NATO, and they would demand that NATO pull back from the east, citing their own security needs. NATO and the Anglo-American governments, however, would find this unacceptable, stating that Russia had no right to make such demands. There was a clear divide, a clear standoff, and now the matters of the limits of NATO and the reach of the Anglo-American order appeared to have run up against conflict. The world was becoming more tense. Domestic populations across the West were becoming more dissatisfied and less trusting. And in 2016, many of these long-simmering problems finally began to come to a head. A referendum vote on whether the United Kingdom should remain within the European Union would be held. To many of the British ruling classes, it was difficult to imagine that people would ever want to leave the European Union. for these classes had become internationalist and globalist. They largely did not think of themselves as part of a country. They viewed themselves as part of a global system, and the idea that the British peoples would give up this system for some sort of parochialist sentiment was simply outside the scope of the worldview which they had come to understand. However, owing to resentments toward the unelected bureaucracy of the European Union, toward heavy-handed European restrictions, toward worsening economic circumstances, and perhaps most of all, toward European policies around immigration, and the vast increase in immigration into the United Kingdom, Britons would vote leave. There would be many efforts to stop this from actually being implemented, and a fierce fight would emerge within the British ruling class, within Whitehall and Westminster. There would be efforts to functionally maintain the United Kingdom as a part of the EU internationalist apparatus. Yet ultimately, the British ruling class knew that they would at some point need to deliver a Brexit. However, at the same time, perhaps an even more shocking event would shake the globalist ruling class of the liberal world order. For in 2016, Donald Trump would be elected president. The world was now in a more tense state of affairs, where a phase change appeared to be emerging. The global financial system of the Eurodollar banks was quite precarious following the 2008 crisis, and now the question for them was whether they could limp along, and whether they could acquire enough of the real wealth, leaving everyone else with dwindling financialized assets and steadily debased currency. Following conflicts in the Pentagon, particularly after US military and CIA assets entered into direct conflict in Syria, Barack Obama's White House had conducted a purge of the brass, and now this new intelligence and military apparatus, which had been involved in the global war on terror for so long, and had built international networks of militants and crime, began to realize that their order, their networks, and their goals may now be threatened. The vast civil servant bureaucracies across all nations of the West, the vast complexes of NGOs which funneled money around in secret, sometimes acting for intelligence, sometimes for politicians. This vast political web as a whole was beginning to see the resentments of the people. They were beginning to see that they were being viewed, that they were in the sunlight, and now they too began to wonder if their position was being threatened. It hit everyone across the West all at once, that perhaps this order, this vast apparatus of wealth and power, this empire that had lived for centuries, and this post-war system, this system of debt, of destabilization, of influence and ethnic conflict, of unaccountable bureaucrats and hidden wealth, of laundering, perhaps now it might truly be in danger. Early into the presidency of Donald Trump, the United States would withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Paris Climate Agreement, while around the same time, the United Kingdom would trigger Article 50 for Brexit, while Prime Minister Theresa May would move to strengthen ties with the United States. However, over the next few years, the United States and China would begin to clash on trade. It appeared as though a trade war were beginning between the two great economies. Donald Trump had tapped into something that had been long simmering in the United States. Going back as far as the 1970s, there was an awareness that the financial and management classes of the United States were inclined to ship the economy offshore, moving their labor inputs from the United States working class to those in cheaper countries. For example, moving a manufacturing labor force to China. The lower classes saw quite evidently that the management and upper class did not care about them at all, and would sell out their homes, their towns, their factories. They would sell out everything that was theirs in order to gain more wealth. And this is a continuation of practices which we have observed since the days of the territorial empires. And though of course there was much more nuance to who was doing what, why, and how it all worked, the American middle and lower classes could quite plainly see that their ruling class had no interest in them, And so many began to see China as a stand-in for globalization. They were aware that much of the manufacturing that previously would have been in the United States and done with United States workers was now occurring in China. And so there was enthusiasm from the lower classes, seeing this as retaliation against the offshoring which had gutted their homes. However, as the buyout of China had been stymied by the Xi Jinping regime, there were many in the Anglo American financial class who as well sought to use this as an avenue, whether as retaliation against Xi Jinping and his faction, or as a means to force financial surrender. There were many interests converging all at once, although all had quite different goals and methods. In France, the Yellow Vest protests would erupt in 2018. This was a widespread outcry across France, and it began to spread into adjacent European countries. The people had had enough of the onerous taxation scheme. They had had enough of the rising costs. They had had enough of how the economy was geared against normal people, and many viewed the state as tyrannical. There was a populist surge sweeping across the West, and all the while, other nations of the world began to adopt more sovereigntist sentiment. It was becoming more clear to people, as dots were connected and pieces were put together, just what the Anglo American liberal world order had meant for everyone, and what its current, post-financial crisis state would mean for their future. It meant worsening quality of life. It meant countries without their sovereignty. It meant international credit colonialism. It meant faraway bankers controlling people's money. It meant offshoring, and increasingly, it appeared to mean an overbearing restrictive state that was more and more trying to clamp down on internet speech. There was a real mood change toward the end of the 2010s, and the regimes across the West could not ignore it. All the while, a rift was forming within the American banking sector. Much of the American banking sector was beholden to the system that had been in place since the end of the Second World War, the London-derived Eurodollar banking system. Yet as the banks of Europe were becoming so much more strained, owing in part to their looser credit policies, their heavy rehypothecation, and to their insufficient collateral, they began to become more desperate. Ideas would begin to emerge like central bank digital currencies. The notion of a currency issued by a central bank, one which was fully and centrally programmable and observable, one which could be very easily restricted or seized, and was very amenable to capital controls. One idea that came out of a BlackRock paper, though had circulated around European banks, was the idea to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy across the West, to have European and American banks, along with their government treasuries, all work in one unified manner. The problem was that after so long, interest rates were extremely low, and they couldn't go back up. The emergency money hose had been turned on full since 2008. So what would happen if there were another financial crisis? There was no more room for monetary policy to save them. So the argument was made, one enormous and coordinated consolidation of monetary and fiscal power across the liberal world order to directly inject liquidity to individuals, an all-powerful centralized helicopter money bailout. It was clear that the new ideas of how to save the system were becoming more and more desperate. Yet to many of the American bankers who were not in such a dire predicament, these solutions were awful. A central bank digital currency would destroy commercial banking. There was very little interest in having the Federal Reserve be wrapped up in an international complex. This move of central bank internationalization had been underway for a long time, although the moves now being proposed were simply too far. In 2019, seeing the state of the European credit market, American banks would begin refusing to issue repo loans at par for European credits and European sovereign debts. They were demanding new or better collateral from the Europeans. The bluff was finally being called. Ultimately, in 2019, there would be a credit crisis. Emerging in the repo market, repo rates would spike enormously. Repos are very short-term overnight loans made between banks. Because they're so short-term, and made between financial institutions of this type. The repo rate is about as close to the base interest rate as it can get in finance. In 2019, large American banks would shift from being net borrowers to net lenders. Banks would reduce their cash reserves held at the Fed, prioritizing their internal needs, all the while becoming more restrictive in terms of what they would lend to European banks. In August 2019, the US debt ceiling would be suspended, leading to a rapid issuance of US Treasuries. Throughout August and into September, the Treasury would drain over $120 billion in bank reserves. There would be very high demand for US dollars from banks in order to finance US Treasury buying, seeing the risk around them, being quite cautious, and particularly being cautious with European banks, along with pre-existing regulatory constraints. Banks would limit the amount of cash that they would make available. On September 16th, quarterly corporate tax payments would result in around $100 billion being withdrawn, reducing bank reserves. And at the same time, $54 billion in long-term treasury debt would settle, increasing the financing needs of primary dealers. Repo rates would spike, with intraday repos spiking 300 basis points above the Fed funds target, with tri-party repo rates spiking much higher. The major American banks would have cash available, and they could have lent it into the repo market, but they chose not to. At this point, the era of ultra-low interest rates was showing that it could not save the system forever. The New York Fed would step in to stabilize the situation. However, it would become clear that the financial system of the world had reached a point where remedies were becoming more drastic. Any bigger shock could take down the whole thing. And to many of the American bankers, it was becoming clear as well that the European banks were in a very risky situation. Everything was tense. There were cracks in the credit system, and now a divide between different factions of bankers was becoming evident. And those short-term, emergency liquidity injections were able to stabilize the situation. It was clear that there was a long-term problem. The global credit system needed some sort of large-scale liquidity injection, the sort that would require central bank and government coordination around the world. The only problem with this is that if one were to coordinate all the central banks and treasuries of the order and have them directly inject stimulus all the way down to the level of individuals, then it would cause enormous inflation. The economy of the entire planet would have to be put into some sort of stasis. But how could one lock down the entire planet and inject it full of cheap money? Well, fortunately for the financial system, exactly that would happen next year. For as the world entered lockdown, the world would be flooded with an enormous supply of very cheap dollars. That year, a peace deal would be established in Afghanistan. The United Kingdom would complete its Brexit transition. The Abraham Accords would be reached, creating some understanding in the Middle East, and the Nagorno-Karabakh War would begin between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Following the 2020 election in the United States, Joe Biden would take office in 2021. The years of the first Trump administration had seen some substantial changes, and had seen what had largely been a rather risky period for the global order. There was constant conflict in the White House between the more populist sovereigntist factions which surrounded Donald Trump and the very powerful neocon factions which dominated the Republican Party. To a great extent, the old guard of the party were able to maintain their power within the new administration. However, there were cracks forming, and all the while, the American people were seeing more and more just how unpalatable these factions of the state were. China would make major moves to break away from the Anglo American financial system. There was a sovereigntist move across the world, and more countries, particularly the commodity producers that had for a long time been dominated from the European banking hubs, were trying to break away and become independent of the order. Some were drawing closer to China. Some were looking toward regional blocs, though many didn't know what to do. Cracks were widening, and once again the financial system appeared to be in question. However, now, there was a real visible divide, as some of the banking factions of the United States began to look upon the traditional banking system of Europe and ask if they really wanted to go down with that ship. In 2021, after Joe Biden would take office as president, the United States would rejoin the Paris Climate Agreements and the World Health Organization. The United States would withdraw from Afghanistan. However, it would follow a different plan and different timetable than had originally been agreed upon, and the resulting pullout would look quite terrible for the United States on the global stage and domestically. The United States would host COP26. The AUKUS Pact for Indo-Pacific Security would emerge with a new Anglo American military strategy. The Taliban would retake control over Afghanistan, and all the while, the liquidity hose would be on full, as the banking system of the world was stabilized, and the world was flooded with cheap dollars. The lockdown era, and particularly the alienation and heavy-handed informational control that accompanied it, would have enormous social ramifications. Distrust in the government and the institutions of the order would reach an explosive high. People would look upon the experts that they were told to trust and see that they were far less impressive than they had once believed, in many cases even believing them to be deceptive or nefarious. The intense informational control grid, the locked-down informational environment around institutional messages, and particularly institutional narratives around the lockdown, would cause people to see the institutions and the informational milieu in a new light. They saw it as draconian, overbearing, and authoritarian, seeing once highly praised and reputable doctors be simply kicked off of the largest platforms for disagreeing with the institutions even a little bit, caused a fundamental change in the informational and social environment. Opposition to the system and the institutions had reached an entirely new level, and it became quite clear to many that not only were the institutions not able to be trusted as they had once believed, but that the order, the system as it existed, had become cancerous and malignant. In 2022, Russia would move in Ukraine. Initially, it would appear as though there may be an agreement between the Russian and Ukrainian states. However, rapidly, the Europeans, and in particular the British, would move to ensure that no such agreement was reached. Europe needed war. In these years, interest rates were very low. However, almost immediately after that war began, the Fed would begin raising rates, and raising rates at the fastest rate that they have ever done. At this point, there were very different visions for the future. The financial order, which had existed since the end of the Second World War, and ultimately, for centuries, was in a very dangerous position, while the intelligence and military capabilities which backed the order were looking more and more precarious. The credit system simply could not continue as it had, and more countries in Europe were becoming concerned with their fiscal positions. Countries like Germany, for example, had for a long time forced purchases of their debt, creating a financial repression regime in order to ensure that there would always be a market for their debt. Yet as interest rates began to climb, this had a very detrimental effect on the Eurodollar system. Since the 1980s, nearly every financial professional had only seen interest rates go down. This created an environment where one could get very wealthy, constantly refinancing, borrowing at lower and lower interest rates. Yet now, in 2022, imagine one to be an international Eurodollar bank. You lend in US dollars. You lend to a country that should have much higher interest rates, yet borrows from your bank at an artificially low US dollar rate. As interest rates began to climb, US dollars increased in value against the domestic currencies of the nations borrowing in dollars. And so, in order to pay back their debts, foreign businesses now needed more and more of their domestic currency in order to buy the same amount of dollars. However, on top of this, they could no longer refinance at lower and lower rates. Rates were rising, and so they needed more and more dollars to pay back their loans. Loans which were only increasing in rate every time they took out a new one. International Eurodollar banks began to see that there was tremendous strain. European countries, and particularly the European Central Bank led by Christine Lagarde, would begin working with Janet Yellen to effect yield curve control, for it was very important to the nations of Europe that the interest rates on their sovereign debt not diverge too far from those of the United States. An inverted yield curve would be engineered, and the dominant idea appeared to be an acknowledgement that this system would end, and perhaps end quite soon. The best option was simply for everyone to go down together, for if many nations of the order were to default while others did not, then capital would simply rush to those who had not defaulted. In order to survive, everyone would need to default together. Additionally, a solution which had always emerged throughout history was that a nation needs a pretense for default, and it needs new collateral assets to back up its system. The Russo-Ukrainian War was perfect, and so we began to see enormous enthusiasm on the part of European politicians and financiers. Europe needed war. They needed to default, and they needed to ensure that the capital did not leave, and thus the nations of Europe began planning capital control systems. They needed the natural resources of Russia and Ukraine, resources to backstop their system so it could continue to run. We would see the United Kingdom make a 100-year partnership agreement with Ukraine, an agreement for Ukraine's resources. All the while, the nations of Europe, and in particular Britain and France, would guarantee Ukrainian debts. They would begin speaking in terms of sending their own populations. However, within Europe, the dissident sentiment was very high. People looked around at their nations, particularly at the large migrant influx, and no longer felt allegiance to the system that dominated their home. Least of all, the unelected European bureaucracy. There was domestic conflict. There was conflict in the East, and the Europeans knew that their financial system would have to crash, be reset, recollateralized, and that there needed to be the backdrop of war, particularly if it could diminish the risk of the native young men. The following year, Hamas would attack Israel. There have been many questions surrounding this event, particularly around what appears to be very lax national security at the time, raising many to conjecture whether this was allowed to happen. Regardless of that, this would serve as the opportunity for Israel to make a large move against Gaza. This would, however, result in intense international backlash, and in the United States, the question of the relationship between the country and Israel would reach an entirely new level of contention, particularly as people began to witness the destruction in Gaza. There are many who claim that Israel is a righteous force defending itself, stating that this was something that had to be done, while there are others who refer to Israel as a brutal imperial force, one which created a prison state. The narratives and sentiment of the West was forever changed, and Israel began to become a serious point of contention. And so 2023 and 2024 rolled on. War was escalating around the world. The Fed was raising rates, all while the interest rate benchmarking system of LIBOR went away, destroying the pricing power over US dollars that had been so long enjoyed by the banks of London. The Europeans and Janet Yellen were engaged in constant yield curve control, trying to protect the debts of Europe. Distrust was enormous, all while it became quite clear that the military which had been created by the United States had become built for more tactical and small-scale operations. It could perhaps deal with a militant insurgency, but was no longer set up to fight with a large nation. And while China demonstrated itself to be more and more powerful, it was becoming self-evident that the post-war order, the rules-based, international, Anglo American empire, no longer could dominate the world. The financial empire was cracking. The rules seemed more to be suggestions. The militaries were no longer capable of enforcing hegemony. Trust was low and conflict was rising across the West. Could a nation even get enough of its young men to fight? Probably not. All the while, ethnic clashes were increasing across Europe. Migration had become a major point of contention, and more countries of the world began to rally against the Anglo American system and the globalist liberal world order. The United States had used the dollar as a weapon against Russia, imposing aggressive sanctions against the Russians and the Chinese, as well demonstrating that the West could simply seize assets. The result of this was to show to much of the world that they could not trust that rules-based order. It had become clear what it always was. The rules-based order was a justification story for the Anglo American system and its dominance. There were no rules. There was no international law. There was no high-minded idealism. It was what has always been: power, wealth, and death. And so seeing the world for what it is, seeing that there are no friends in geopolitics, seeing that the world really is a dangerous place, and that nations must look out for themselves, that people must be concerned with themselves, their families, their people, the order had now truly begun to crumble. There was no future in this. Yet still the question remained: could the powers behind the order, could the powerful bankers, could the powerful politicians, could the powerful intelligence and crime bosses, could any of the old elite save themselves? How much would be preserved? How much of the system could continue? It was now a scramble to take what could be taken, to preserve what could be preserved. And that process meant war. It meant capital control. It meant heavy-handed regulation. For now, the question as to the survival of the order was over. It was clear that it would not survive. And now the question existed for the powerful entities, those wealthy and powerful families, those factions. Could they survive? Could they preserve their power? And could they abscond and take the wealth? More and more of the world was pulling away, and the West looked to be more and more of a powder keg. And in 2024, after the United States presidential election, a new regime would begin, and we would enter into what we have today. A world where there are many futures that stretch out before us. A world that is filled with risks. And now, as so many dangerous and powerful figures scramble for their survival, we will take a look at the possible futures that stretch out ahead.